All right, we are talking about Chapter 11, the trials and the triumphs and travails of the Jeffersonian Republic, aka the ups and downs of Jefferson's presidency. So the intro kind of just is setting us up for this chapter. This chapter is talking about, well, initially we'll talk about a big election, the election of 1800, and that is John Adams, our Federalist president, running for a second term against our Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson. So remember, Federalists are all about a strong national government, and then our Democratic Republicans, they are for state rights. They are for a strict interpretation of the Constitution. So if you're reading the Constitution, if power is not specifically given to the national government or the federal government, then they don't have that power. So a strict interpretation of the Constitution. They're all about political and economic liberty. They don't want a big national government to get in your way. Hashtag Ron Swanson on Parks and Recreation. And also, Jefferson is all about having a society built on small farms. So agrarian purities, how you could say that. So, salt of the earth people working hard on their small farms, making a living, democracy in action. That's what he thinks. So kind of just setting up this dialect here, or these two parties. So Section A, Federalist and Republican mudslingers. So when I say mudslingers, or when the book talks about mudslingers, they're talking about in elections when they stop talking about the issues and start, attacking each other's characters. So the Federalist Party kind of starts to mudsling within the Federalist Party, meaning this. The Federalist Party in 1800 was split between a fraction who really, really wanted to go to war with France and a fraction that supported Adams' decision not to go to war with France. All right, so the XYZ affair initiated or sparked that 2.5 years of undeclared warfare with France, and Americans were really expecting that we're eventually going to officially declare war on France. We were building up our army, we were building up our navy, we reinstated the Marine Corps. I mean, all of these things, we're preparing for war with France. But when Adams said, you know what, no, I'm going to smooth that over, we're not going to declare war, that really ticked some people off, especially in the Federalist Party, those who hated France. Federalists were pro-Britain, so those who hated France were ticked off by Adams' action, and that caused the split in the party. Even Hamilton, remember the guy who did the National Bank thing, the Secretary of Treasury under Washington? Hamilton even writes this pamphlet all about how much he hates Adams. So the two Federalists are kind of fighting each other. And Jefferson was more than happy just to sit back and take Hamilton's pamphlet and publish it. So there was some mudslinging happening within the Federalist Party itself. And then, there was some mudslinging against Jefferson as well. It was called a whispering campaign, kind of like gossip, whispers. So people were like, hey, did you hear? Jefferson is having an affair with one of his slaves, which is actually true, Sally Hemings. So even today, there's a whole society of descendants of Sally Hemings that exists. And then, there'd be other whispers, hey, did you know that he stole a widow's trust fund? And then the clergy, they just hated Jefferson. Because Jefferson, remember when he was helping to create Virginia's Constitution, was all about the separation of church and state. So the clergy hated him. They called him an atheist. They're just like, no, Jefferson bad. So there was some mudslinging happening in this election cycle. All right, let's talk about B, the Jeffersonian Revolution of 1800. So exciting, I know. Contain yourselves. All right, so Jefferson won this election because of the swing state of New York. So actually this was a really close election. New York kind of decided it. New York ended up going to Jefferson because his running mate, or his VP candidate, vice president candidate, Aaron Burr, was from New York. So New York, they knew Aaron Burr, so New York swung then to the Democratic Republicans. Also notice in this chapter, they're now starting to shorten Democratic Republicans just to Republicans. So they'll just start referring to Jefferson's party as Republicans, just so you know. So the Republicans win, but here's the deal. Back in the day, each member of the Electoral College got 2 votes. So whoever got the most votes became president, and whoever had the second amount of votes became vice president. So the deal was somewhere somebody messed up, because in the eyes of the Democratic Republicans all along, Jefferson was supposed to win, and then Aaron Burr was just supposed to get 1 vote fewer than Jefferson, so that Aaron Burr become vice president. Somewhere somebody messed up. So instead of Jefferson getting that extra vote, they actually tied. Whoops. So what happens in a tie? Well, the Constitution tells us if there's a tie in the Electoral College, then the decision goes to the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives is pretty much split right down the middle between our Federalists and our Democratic Republicans. So when it goes to the House, there's kind of a deadlock because, Federalists don't want Jefferson, Federalists don't want Aaron Burr, but in the big picture, they absolutely hate Jefferson and would much rather see Aaron Burr become president because they just hate Jefferson. So it's a deadlock. I think it goes to 35 votes. They're voting. Nothing's coming out of this. So finally, someone gives in somewhere, and Jefferson actually does become president, which was the intention all along. But it's just one of those weird things, one of the kinks in government that we've now sorted out. But that's kind of talking about that election a little bit. All right. Yes. So yeah, why we call it the Revolution of 1800? Good question. Why would we call it the Revolution? It was just an election after all. Yeah, but it was a peaceful transfer of political power between 2 rival parties. So this just doesn't happen in Europe at this time. If there is a transfer of power, it's usually in the form of bloodshed, right? Somebody has to die for me to take power. So the idea that this democracy thing is actually working is revolutionary. So you're saying the Federalists just handed over their power to the Democratic Republicans? They didn't, there was no one slit anybody's throats? What? This is a new thing. This is revolutionary, a peaceful transfer of power. In fact, this wouldn't happen in Britain for at least another generation. Good job, America. Yeah, democracy is kind of actually working here. That is great. All right, anything else to say for that? No, let's go to C then. Responsibility breeds moderation. This is kind of funny. So here's the deal. Jefferson, and something you'll notice about him all this chapter, Jefferson is an idealist. In his mind, he's very smart, very intelligent, very bookish, kind of a big nerd, but he has all of these big ideals. But the thing is, when ideals hit reality, compromise typically has to happen. So they'll give some examples of that. But let's just talk about first, him as president. So what he really wanted to make people realize is he was not a monarch. He was not a king. And he didn't want to be treated like that. So he often did some things to kind of reinstate that idea, I am not a monarch, okay? So one thing is he refused to use the carriage and the horse to get to work. He would walk to work, just like everybody else. Another thing he did is at official dinner parties, he would not allow, or whatever, allow, he didn't have seating according to rank. In Europe, and before this point, everyone would sit according to rank. He didn't do that. He got rid of that idea. Also, it says sometimes he would greet visitors, like, pretty much in his pajamas, like, very sloppy attire, you know. So that's just going, I'm not a monarch, I'm just a typical person. Really, pajamas, Jefferson? Where's your wife? Whatever. We're not going to go there. It's a very traumatic story. Anyway, so he's just trying to point the fact that I am not a monarch here. And breeding moderation, meaning like even in his inaugural address, he said, we are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. He's saying that I am not going to come into Washington and wreak havoc on everything Federalist. I'm not going to overturn everything. You know, I'm going to be moderate here. I'm not a dictator. I'm just going to make some changes, but I'm not going to get rid of everything that's in place already. And one of the things he does to prove that is through his power of presidential appointments or patronages. All right? So as president, you get this cool thing where you can appoint or choose whomever you want to fulfill just some everyday, day-to-day jobs that's required in the presidency. Different official positions like head of the post office or head of this or that. Like that's just your prerogative or your right as president to appoint whoever they want. So Jefferson gets into office, and his friends, his buddies are ready for it. His friends want him to fire all of Adams' appointees to get rid of them so then they could get the jobs. But that's not what Jefferson decides to do. What Jefferson decides to do is to keep most of John Adams' appointees. So he's like, well, why would I fire these people? If these people are doing a good job, there's no reason for me to fire them just because they're Federalists. So this is another notion. He's moderate. He's not just going to get rid of everything Federalist and set up a new regime. No, he's just going to be tweaking some things here and there. Fair enough. All right. So let's go to section D, Jeffersonian restraint. Same sort of idea. Okay. Not going to, get rid of everything and start from scratch. We're just going to be modifying some things. So he does make some modifications. For example, he gets rid of the excise tax. An excise tax is a tax on domestic goods. So he gets rid of that. Mostly because, he's all about small farms. He wants a lot of small farms, so he has a lot of support in the South, where there's a lot of farms, and in the West. Okay, so he gets rid of this excise tax to help benefit the farmers. That's something he does. Another thing he does is he gets rid of the last vestiges of the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien and Sedition Acts had expired. Okay, they had on their own. They had expired. They had gone away. However, there were still people in prison because of these acts, and there were still people that had a lot of fines to pay because of these acts. So what Jefferson does is these acts are already gone, but he pardons all those that were in prison because of them, and he takes away all the fines that were imposed through these acts. So he's kind of just erasing those last vestiges of the Alien and Sedition Acts. Something else he does is he changes the requirements to become a citizen from 14 years, which is a long time, back to 5 years, which it was before the Alien and Sedition Acts. That's glorious. Good job, Jefferson. But all in all, he doesn't change a lot, especially economically. He's still assuming those state debts. He's still promising to pay every penny of the loans or every penny of debt we gained in the Revolutionary War. He's still keeping the National Bank. Those are all the same. So mostly everything's the same. He just tweaks a couple things. He has a really good Secretary of Treasury, by the way. His name is Albert Gallatin. And what he does, Albert, Al for short, the Secretary of Treasury was awesome because he really reduced the debt and he balanced the budget. So we're not spending over our means, okay? We have a budget. This is how much we can spend on the military. We don't exceed that. So this is really good advice. And he takes it. So the Secretary of Treasury, Albert Gallatin, is doing a great job reducing that debt, balancing the budget. And it just kind of goes to show, like just because there's a change of power, Jefferson's saying, just because there's a change of power doesn't mean that it's going to, be a disaster for the people who just lost the power. By no means. All right, next section, section E, the dead clutch of the judiciary. Whoever wrote this book is a complete nerd. Whatever. All right, so Adams is on the way out. He knows it. Adams knows that he is on the way out, but he wants to kind of entrench these Federalist ideas somehow, some way, so that when Adams leaves, there's still some Federalists around to make some changes, to make some racket, okay? So what he does is he creates 16 new federal, meaning national, judges. And all of these judges happen to be Federalists. Big surprise. And all of these judges happen to be appointed for the rest of their lives. So they'll be around for a while to drive the Democratic Republicans mad. So these 16 new judges are called midnight judges because Adams, on his last couple days in office, wrote these commissions. So people were like, well, he was staying up till midnight the night before, Jefferson came into power, writing these 16 commissions. It wasn't actually true, but you get the point. They're called midnight judges. All right, so let's figure this out. Okay, so here we go. Here steps in another Federalist, and his name is John Marshall, super famous in American history. He is a Supreme Court justice. In fact, he is the head of the Supreme Court, or he is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And Adams appoints him, and this guy, John Marshall, will be the head of the Supreme Court for the next 34 years. So we're talking about, Adams trying to entrench the government with Federalist ideas. He makes these 16 new judges, and he appoints, of course, our friend John Marshall. John Marshall is a Federalist, and you can kind of think of him as like twinsies with Hamilton. Remember, Hamilton's the one who created the Federalist Party? Well, John Marshall, they had the same ideas, same strong national government ideas. And John Marshall kind of got these ideas from his life experiences. So John Marshall was a soldier for America in the Revolutionary War. He was actually under George Washington. So he did experience the hardships of Valley Forge. Remember, Valley Forge was that winter that Washington's troops spent, starving to death. They didn't have enough clothes. Their feet were all bloody. There was a lot of smallpox going around. Just that horrible time in the Revolutionary War. And John Marshall remembers this, and he thinks this is a result. Valley Forge is a result of a weak central government. He's thinking, if we had had a better leadership, if we had a stronger national government, Valley Forge would never have happened. So John Marshall is all about a strong federal government, so he believes that's the only way to keep America, on the right course, the only way to ensure something like Valley Forge doesn't happen again. So he is kind of like a big deal. And one of the reasons he's a big deal is because of this court case. There'll be lots of court cases from John Marshall, so don't fret. There's plenty we'll talk about from him. But one of the big ones, famous, is Marbury versus Madison. Okay, so the general idea here, the important part, is the result of this case. I'll explain what it was about a little bit, but the big idea here is the result. So Marbury versus Madison answers for America the question of who gets to interpret the Constitution? I know, this is just intriguing, is it not? Who gets to interpret the Constitution? We created the Constitution, but who gets to interpret it? I don't know. Okay, Jefferson was all like, it should be the states. States' rights. You know, we had that Kentucky resolution from last chapter that was talking about, Kentucky trying to declare the Alien and Sedition Acts to be unconstitutional. That didn't fly, so we're like, okay, it's not the states apparently. What John Marshall is saying, it's actually, who gets to interpret the Constitution? We do. Supreme Court does. That's who gets to interpret the Constitution. And that is something called judicial review. Judges, judicial review, look over laws. So it's up to the up to the Supreme Court to declare if something is constitutional, or the law is in line with the Constitution, or if it's unconstitutional, meaning this law is not in line with the Constitution. And this whole precedent is set up through the Supreme Court case of Marbury versus Madison. That's the big idea. Judicial review, Supreme Court gets to decide if a law is constitutional or not. That's the big idea. So the details, shall we? Okay, William Marbury is one of those midnight judges that was created by Adams the last day of his presidency. So Adams had, written and signed off on the commission giving William Marbury the judgeship of Washington, D.C. However, when Thomas Jefferson comes into office, he goes to his Secretary of State, James Madison, and is like, hey, James Madison, hey, how are you doing today? You know those commissions that Adams had signed but didn't actually deliver? Let's not deliver those. Let's just put those on a shelf and forget they exist. So Madison, Secretary of State's like, yes, President, I will not deliver this commission. Marbury's ticked, sues Madison, because Marbury wants his job. He wants to be the judge of New York, or not New York, of D.C. So it's kind of just, Marbury is suing the Secretary of State, trying to get that commission delivered so he can actually become judge. Long story short, what Marshall does is he takes one of the laws that Marbury is arguing from. So Marbury keeps pointing to this Judiciary Act of 1789. You don't need to remember that. But there's this act that Marbury keeps pointing to. Like, remember this, remember this, remember this? What Marshall does, John Marshall does, is he actually doesn't really decide in this case necessarily. What he says is this Judiciary Act that Marbury keeps pointing to is kind of moot because he declares it unconstitutional, thus establishing the president of the Supreme Court getting to decide if something is constitutional or not. What ends up happening in the long run is Marshall just pretty much tells Marbury to go back to the lower courts, try a different approach to your argument, and go from there. So, the really big thing here is all about giving the Supreme Court the right to interpret the Constitution. Long story short, that was just a long story. All right, and then this section just kind of ends a little bit about talking about Jefferson is obviously mad at the Supreme Court for doing this, for kind of, in his eyes, stealing the power to interpret the Constitution. Jefferson is mad at the Supreme Court. So Jefferson, in retaliation, tries to impeach one of the justices. Okay, not John Marshall. John Marshall, whatever. So he picks on Samuel Chase. He's another justice in the Supreme Court. And Jefferson tries his darndest to get him thrown out or to impeach him. And guess what? It doesn't really work. Okay, Sam Chase is still there at the end of the day. But that's another, important precedent saying just because you're mad at a justice is not a good reason to kick them out. All right, so we will then pick up next video with section F.